Interestingly, a majority of respondents in all 4 of Ukraine's macro regions placed the war above these other concerns, though there was higher concern in the east, the region located closest to the war in Donbas. In addition to a deep concern among the public with the war, another reason why we might expect public opinion to exert greater influence in foreign policy now than earlier in Ukraine's history is the new political environment. During unsettled times, when an opening in political life occurs, public opinion is more likely to influence leaders. And political change following Euromaidan and Russia's invasion in 2014, as well as the change in political elites following the election of Zelensky, might provide this kind of opening. Therefore, the central question my research poses is, does popular opinion about the war constrain or motivate Zelensky's policies? And more broadly, does public opinion influence Ukrainian foreign policy? In order to address this question, it's necessary to ask the prior questions. What is public opinion about foreign policy, and how are popular opinions on foreign policy formed? So the particular research project is in its very early stage, and I will not provide a definitive answer today. We know from a very interesting Konar's memo by Serhiy Kudelia, he's clearly shown how Zelensky's negotiating position was influenced by pressure as a result of protests by war veterans and parliamentary factions in fall 2019. But popular opinion in general has not crystallized into a strong political pressure campaign, and it's an open question as to whether it will, and whether Zelensky will respond to that pressure. So today I'd like to discuss some of the contours of public opinion toward the war and suggest, mainly based on findings from my focus groups, that attitudes may be less polarized into a pro-Russian versus pro-European camp than we tend to think with regard to the war, which may give Zelensky more flexibility in his foreign policy positions. Before discussing popular opinion, I briefly discussed my approach to the question, how are popular opinions in foreign policy formed? And I just want to make a point here that oligarch-owned television has played a large role in shaping public opinion in Ukraine, as is well known, and oligarchs have aligned with political leaders who've been sharply divided on foreign policy for years. And Ukrainian public opinion has mirrored this divide in its geopolitical orientation between one pole that is pro-Europe and the other that is pro-Russia or Eurasia. And an insightful chapter by Paul Danieri and Taras Kuzio have argued that, at least until recently, this bifurcation has produced static public opinion with little influence on foreign policy. Recently, however, there's been a significant increase in the number of people who consume news on the internet. And according to a Razumkov poll from this July, although television remains the most popular news source for people, a significant percentage rely on news sites on the internet or on social networks. And data show that Facebook and YouTube are among the most popular sites in Ukraine. So news bloggers or vloggers who appear on YouTube and Facebook have become a popular source of information news for people, introducing new voices to the oligarch-dominated news media. And I hypothesize that a wider array of actors may introduce more varied ideas than in the past, which may impact the character of the debate about foreign policy. So I decided this summer to begin analyzing discourse on video news blogs with my research assistant. And while many of the video blogs are offshoots of well-known media channels, others are individual bloggers. Some bloggers have huge followings, such as Shari, while other bloggers are local. An initial analysis suggests that some of the large bloggers with a large number of followers show that while their position is consistent, the criticism and praise of Zelensky can change over time. So this may contribute an element of unpredictability to the media environment and the discussion about the war in Ukraine. Turning to the question of what is public opinion toward the war in Donbas and towards Zelensky's foreign policies. First of all, it's clear that a majority of Ukrainians are committed to a reintegration of the occupied Donbas, and this hasn't changed for many years. And second, looking at more recent opinion polls, they show consistent support for compromise in negotiations rather than a military victory to end the conflict. So looking at this recent data, if you add together the first two choices here, we see that 68% favor compromise, whereas 22% believe peace can only be achieved through a position of strength, i.e. military dominance. And these percentages have been stable for years. Okay, and finally, on the issue of one of the terms of the Minsk agreements, whether elections should be held in Ordlo, in the DNR and LNR, and whether those regions should be given such special status, it's clear that there's opposition to these terms of the Minsk agreement, and this makes sense. This would be an adoption of the Russian position, but it's also clear that there's some degree of a strong support for adopting these conditions. So there's just a variable kind of set of opinions, even on this very controversial issue. So summarizing, there's strong support among the population for ending the conflict. There's strong support for compromise of some kind in order to end the war, but a majority opposes elections and special status that would freeze the authority of the current separatist authorities in DNR and LNR, although about a 1/3 minority is in favor. So Zelensky's overall policy of the past year, taking steps and compromises to end the war by negotiating with Russia and initially accepting the Steinmeier formula, are generally consistent with popular opinion that tends to favor ending the war and compromise in order to do so. And an interesting issue is how specific opinions about ending the war relate to the broader geopolitical orientation of Ukrainians. And this remains to be investigated, but I just want to make one point. Many important studies have shown that the divide between the geopolitical orientation between Europe versus Russia has diminished, and this is correct, and we heard this in the focus groups as well. To a degree, the divide continues, especially in the eastern and southern regions that show continuing support for a pro-Russian position. But what I want to talk about briefly is the emergence of the new category on the question of geopolitical orientation, which is the non-aligned category, that Ukraine should be not aligned. And I would argue, based on focus group material, that this is not a placeholder or residual category for people who are embarrassed to tell the pollster that they're actually still supporting Russia. I actually heard in focus groups two variants. That first variant, that both Russia and Ukraine, that Ukraine should be oriented toward both Russia and Europe and welcome relations with both states in a very pragmatic sense. And another variant, that Ukraine should not orient toward either. And people oppose the idea that Ukraine must choose a larger power to align with. And they're often resentful of the attitudes of Europeans who they see as exploitative or disrespectful. So finishing up, I hypothesize that the category of non-aligned or pragmatic may overlap with the category of people who favor negotiations to end the war. And they do not see the war in grand geopolitical terms, as the attentive population does, and certainly as analysts do, but in a different vein. Many see the war as a war that benefits leaders who make money, just really kind of understandings of the war that are quite orthogonal to the traditional ways that most people think about the war. And they tend to see, we heard a lot in the focus group that leaders can stop the war when they want to. So these kind of inchoate interpretations of war are nevertheless connected to strong emotions and commitments about ending the war. And how they specifically relate to the current policy the president is undertaking really remains to be investigated. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elise. So our next presentation is by Serhiy Kudilia, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. His presentation is entitled Veto on Peace, Veto on War, Zelensky's Donbas Imbroglio. And I would note that you can find a memo on which his talk will be based at our website, ponarseurasia.org. And traditionally, I forgot to mention this in the introduction, at our annual policy conferences, presentations are based on policy memos which then are either published just before the talks or will be rolled out later. So yeah, I would encourage you to take a look at the website for the memos based on these talks, or they'll be coming out soon, possibly. I mean, not everybody might present a memo, but this is the idea. So let's turn things over to Serhiy.
All right, thank you. And I want to add that I wrote my memo in February of this year. And so now with the benefit of extra 6 months, I will add some more of my reflections on what happened over the last half a year in Ukraine and in the context of Donbas settlement. So let me start with first the question, what were some of candidate Zelensky's promises on Donbas? And then we'll move on and look at some of his accomplishments, analyze the reasons for very limited progress that we've seen on the Donbas conflict this year. We all remember that in the very first interview that Zelensky gave as a candidate, he promised to find middle ground with Vladimir Putin. He said that we will both meet somewhere in between. We will make concessions to each other and ultimately we'll make a deal. So there was a conviction on his part that he can actually make an agreement with Putin through negotiations. He also expected to include additional actors into the normative format. Specifically, he wanted to bring the United States and the United Kingdom to the table. And finally, as a candidate, he also stressed the importance of a humanitarian outreach to separatist-controlled Donbas. He argued for lifting or easing trade restrictions and for reviewing the current pension policy that limits or bans pensioners in separatist-controlled Donbas from getting pensions in Ukraine. Now, as president, Zelensky never really articulated a strategic vision for how he wants to end the conflict. And in a way, many of his statements were more responses or reactions to what different parties wanted or asked him to do. And two specific, very important examples of his speeches and statements come from the Paris summit in December of 2019 and the Munich Security Conference in February of this year. So specifically, just to rehash some of the commitments that he made at these meetings, in Paris, in the communique, he committed Ukraine to fulfilling 2015 Minsk Accords. So even though he criticized Minsk agreements, he still argued that Ukraine has to follow up and fulfill all of the commitments that Poroshenko took. He also expressed interest in providing special status to parts of Donbas that are currently occupied. And finally, he argued in favor of incorporating the Steinmeier formula into the Ukrainian legislation that specified or regulated the time when the special status will come into force. At the Munich Security Conference further on, he argued for the creation or formation of a public dialogue platform, which he called Peace in Donbas, which would be an alternative for direct talks with separatist leaders. So he long refused to engage in any direct negotiations with leaders of the separatist republics. And instead, he suggested to bring on board various civic activists from both sides and to create this forum where people would engage and exchange their views. He also expressed interest or commitment to holding local elections in both Ukraine-controlled Donbas and separatist-controlled areas in October of this year, so this month, and committed himself to further disengagement and prisoner exchange with the separatists. Now, it's important to say that almost none of these points that Zelensky committed himself to were fulfilled. In fact, some of the key political provisions that he agreed to, for example, the permanent special status, has been rejected by the very officials that now worked for Zelensky. Steinmeier formula was never incorporated into the Ukrainian legislation. Public dialogue platform fell apart after it was undermined by pressure from outside activists. Local elections in Donbas, obviously in separatist-controlled Donbas, are not happening. It is now a very important point of contention with Russia. And even in parts of Ukraine-controlled Donbas, local elections are also not happening. And there has been no further disengagement of Ukrainian troops or any other prisoner exchanges happening since December of last year. So on the positive side of Zelensky's one-year record, of course, there have been fewer ceasefires we see a significant reduction in the number of fatalities, both among the military and the civilians. And there was a partial prisoner exchange and limited disengagement last year. But on the political side of things, so we see the preconditions for at least ending an active military engagements. But on the political side, there is really no progress on finding the settlement for a broader conflict. So there is no strategic progress whatsoever. In fact, there has been backtracking on many of the political commitments that Zelensky earlier made as president. I already mentioned the special status provision, which is not viewed as a possibility now by the Ukrainian side. And also, importantly, the security dimension. So the demand that to control the border is one of the key demands that Zelensky now expresses for holding local elections. There has been also chaos in appointment policy of Zelensky as far as negotiation group is concerned in Minsk. Continuous reshuffling of various negotiators. There were already two heads of negotiating team, the trilateral contact group in Minsk, Kuchma, now Kravchuk. One of Kravchuk's deputies was just fired a couple of days ago. So there is a chaotic approach to appointment policies, which is also exemplified in other areas, of course, as well. Humanitarian dimension, which Zelensky stressed as a candidate, is completely out of focus. The only initiative that he tried to push through the parliament, and that is an idea of extending pension payments to people, older people who live, Ukrainians who live in separatist controlled areas, was buried by Zelensky's own faction in the parliament, and there is no progress on that part. And finally, one of the biggest disappointments for many people living in Donbas is the fact that Zelensky refused to hold elections, local elections in 18 territories of Ukraine-controlled Donbas, including in such large cities as Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Mariupol, citing, ironically, the worsening security situation in these areas, even though there actually has been significant improvement. So what are some of the reasons for these changes in Zelensky's position? Well, one can argue that Zelensky never had any position, that Zelensky was actually a blank slate, and people just wrote on that blank slate whatever they wanted. And so Zelensky was, in a way, these positions were imposed on Zelensky from outside. Others may argue that Zelensky may have been opportunistic in his political positioning, and when he faced significant pushback from other political elites and civil society, he decided to reverse some of his prior commitments. And in a way, we definitely saw significant pushback from the civil society. So there is a large, significant minority, which I would call irreconcilables as far as their position is concerned, which basically means no compromises are possible with Russia. And these are people who basically favor a military solution to the conflict. They include former veterans of militias and paramilitary groups. They include members or leaders of center-right parties and opposition parties like Poroshenko, Vakarchuk, Tymoshenko. And of course, there are also far-right groups like the National Courts, and all of them participated actively in protests against Zelensky in the fall of last year under the slogan, "No to capitulation." So any compromises, even slightest compromises that Zelensky hinted on, were immediately pushed back by this alliance of civic activists and politicians with the accusations that Zelensky is surrendering Ukrainian sovereignty. And in fact, the opposition parties in the parliament, the three opposition leaders, Vakarchuk, Tymoshenko, and Poroshenko, they successfully coordinated their position around the so-called red lines, which in fact were the bargaining positions of Poroshenko, and imposed that position on Zelensky. And ultimately, Zelensky had to accept these red lines, and in fact moved back to the position that Poroshenko took when he was president, and that ended in the stalemate that we're seeing right now in Donbas. It's also important to note that Zelensky's party faction is also split. So initially there was some momentum for the adoption of new laws that could help to resolve the conflict. Zelensky's party, of course, historically won the majority of the seats in the Ukrainian parliament. But after a few months, we saw fracturing within the party itself, the emergence of different factions. And now we see that there is a significant divergence in the opinion on the future of us within Zelensky's own faction. And in a way, it reflects a very divided voter base of Vladimir Zelensky, where the majority of voters of Zelensky actually prefer status quo. So here you see the breakdown of voter position based on preferences behind 5 major political parties and political leaders. And out of 5 major political parties that are represented in the parliament, 4 voters of the 4 parties actually prefer status quo, meaning the freezing of the conflict, to the autonomy, to the provision of the special status to Donbas. And in the case of Zelensky, they basically, the supporters of status quo outnumber almost 2 to 1. The same goes for other political parties. So what we saw, if you try to use the spatial model and demonstrate the positioning of different political parties along 2 issues. First, the autonomy of Donbas, and second, the sequencing of security measures. So whether or not to establish control of the border with Russia before or after elections. This is the key security issue at stake. We see that most political parties in the parliament favor the status quo and favor a more hardline position. And only one party, Medvedchuk's party, is actually in favor of giving more autonomy and in favor of making concessions as far as security sequencing is concerned. So that puts a lot of gravitation on the status quo and makes Zelensky's party and Zelensky himself orient himself towards maintaining the status quo. The status quo now is seen as a preferable solution. And as a result, we are seeing a great realignment of Zelensky in the direction of Poroshenko's policy positions. So some of the key benefits as far as the settling of the Donbas conflict is concerned, of course, contradictory bargaining goals. We don't know whether Zelensky wants to revise Minsk Accords or to fulfill them. There is a lot of confusion and chaos on that issue. Zelensky showed himself as a very weak leader who is caving into the pressure from outside actors, incapable of producing his own policy positions. And his key negotiator on Donbas, Andriy Yermak, the head of his presidential office, actually has a very low credibility in Ukraine because he was implicated in a number of corruption scandals, and many accuse him of having ties to businesses that are friendly to the Kremlin. Ultimately, the problem comes down to the fact that there is nothing to bargain with Putin, primarily because none of the issues that overlap, there is no overlap between the positions of the Kremlin and Kiev with this change in Zelensky's views. What is next for Donbas? I would say that the inconclusive talks, unfortunately, they benefit both sides. Russia benefiting because it continues the conflict and weakens Ukraine. Ukraine benefits because Zelensky shows that he's trying to negotiate with Russia and fails and blames all the failures on Russia. But in a way, it's appealing to his voters. At least he presents himself as a peacemaker. But with the lowering in the intensity of hostilities, we see that there is no external impetus for a settlement. There is no pressure from the West at all to push the sides to the agreement. And so if to make a prediction, basically, unless we see an increase in the cost of the status quo to all parties concerned, I don't think we're going to see a drastic change in the current bargaining range. And so the most likely scenario that we're going to see for the coming years will be a partitioned Donbas with the separatist republics remaining under the Russian control.
Okay, thank you very much. So next we have Mikhail Alexeyev, who is professor of political science at San Diego State University, and his presentation is Under the Cover of COVID-19, Reverse Irredentism Rising in East Ukraine's People's Republics. And so this presentation will also be based on, but not limited to, another memo that's been published already. So he'll be giving you kind of updated analysis and additional material here. So please take it away.
Did you guys see the slides?
Yes.
This shared screen. Well, thank you very much, Henry. And it is a pleasure to be at this virtual PONAS annual conference. I have been to those since 1999. It's a great pity not to be doing it in person, but fantastic that we have this opportunity. And I also want to thank Ponas and Henry and Marlene, especially for launching this COVID special project that we had earlier this year. This memo that was published in June is the outgrowth of that endeavor. And one thing we did was to look at other collective studies that identified potential impact of crisis, such as the global pandemics, on various political, social, economic aspects in societies. And we have one of the conclusions from there was that when groups face significant threat, especially rising to existential threat to health and well-being, in those circumstances, identity issues become particularly acute. And so I thought that the outbreak of COVID would be an interesting kind of keyhole to take a look at political identities in the Russia-assisted occupied territories of Ukraine, the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And we saw that they were not immune to COVID as well. They saw significant increases, although per capita less than Russia and less than Ukraine. But in terms of crystallizing identity, I asked the question whether in these circumstances there will be on the official side of the leadership of these republics, and whether there will be some kind of a push to either take steps to reintegrate more with Ukraine, or to assert some kind of independent, proud status, or to move toward Russia. And the upshot is, to give you the bottom line up front, is that the move is toward Russia. I call it reverse irredentism. That is, you have those statelets that are quasi-separatist, but they are in actual fact taking steps gradually to reintegrate with the larger state across the border. Now, as far as reintegration into Ukraine, quite a few incentives to actually improve ties with Ukraine, use it as an opportunity perhaps to resolve some issues, put the conflict on hold, and promote common spaces that may help resolve acute medical issues and public health problems. There is tremendous interdependence, social and economic interdependence between those territories still. In some surveys, about 1 in 3 respondents in the occupied territories of the Donbas said they visit other parts of Ukraine at least once every 6 months. 1 in 6 visited once a month before the onset of the crisis and closure of the borders in March. You also had a lot of medical needs in the region, and there were a lot of people traveling from the DNR, LNR areas to other parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and also to other oblasts, to Zaporizhia and Dnipro, for medical treatments that were no longer available in those territories. The hotlines of public organizations dealing with emergency assistance during COVID were running red hot indeed, with number of calls increasing several times fold about people complaining that they cannot take their sick relatives for treatment to other parts of Ukraine. Also, in some studies in 2016 and 2019, those numbers stayed pretty solid. German pollsters, phone polls in the DNR, LNR territories actually found still, regardless of the massive official media campaign against vilifying Ukraine in every respect, you still had 56% saying that they would like to actually return to Ukraine. And I remember watching a BBC report from a correspondent standing on the at the checkpoint, and that was shortly before the pandemic, asking every person going back and forth whether they wanted to be, in Ukraine or remain in those separatist entities. Every single one of them said it would be actually good to get back to Ukraine. So there was this kind of social push. However, from the leadership standpoint, it was probably voiced very well by Denis Pushilin, the DNI head, right from the get-go, rejecting any idea that these republics would go to Ukraine for assistance. And if you look at the media now, I did the media analysis. That was part of this kind of outgrowth of the COVID project. I almost felt at some point like I was Gary Steinhardt when he, the author of Absurdistan, when he sequestered himself at the Four Seasons Hotel in Manhattan and just exposed himself to the Russian media. And after 3 or 4 days, he couldn't have more of it, and he concluded it was a biohazard. So it was kind of similar feeling with reading constantly the DNI and LNR official news, and for me it was like an Orwellian time travel back to the world of the Soviet TASS sort of universe. But these kinds of reports, I believe, are indicative of the official position. And if you look at the characterization of the COVID situation, you see that there was an attempt at first, especially to portray it as if it was positive, everything was fantastic. Then more negative reports emerged, and kind of the ministry, these entities have ministries of health that started reporting data on a regular basis. But with regard to Ukraine, the key tone was complaining that the borders were closed too precipitously, that and in particular that Ukraine armed forces continued to bombard territories of the DNR, LNR entities, that Ukraine was not dealing well with the pandemic, that it was a threat to contaminate people in DNR, LNR through any kind of cross-border interactions from Russia. On the Russian side, however, regarding Russia, you see on the right-hand side of the graph, pretty much mostly gratitude. And that was interesting because one thing that was very conspicuous was that Russia did not actually reach out the way it could have reached out to DNR, LNR with the onset of the pandemic. We remember how Russia had these big public relations events sending medical assistance to the United States and to Italy. With the regard to DNR, LNR, Russia by then dispatched almost 100 what they call humanitarian convoys, those columns of Russian military trucks repainted white that nobody ever examined because the border control was dismantled. And none of those convoys, I mean, you could have conceived of one of those convoys triumphantly delivering aid to DNR, LNR. That did not happen. And nevertheless, every time any DNR official made some kind of statement on Russia, they said, well, they give us the information, they provide us with all the assistance, they're experts, advisors, and in essence, DNR and LNR integrated their healthcare system with the Russian Ministry of Health and used all the Russian guidelines to deal with the pandemic. And that is part of that kind of other trend that I have observed precisely during those times. So as I mentioned, COVID response integrated with the Russian Ministry of Health, but also there were significant moves to facilitate getting Russian citizenship in DNR, LNR. One of the prerequisites, for instance, for getting Russian citizenship is actually getting citizenship officially of LNR, DNR. And those applications were promoted and eased. Quotas for wait lists were removed, so more people could join the wait lists for Russian citizenship precisely at this time of the crisis. Even when the borders were closed, exceptions were made for DNR, LNR residents to travel to Rostov Oblast for receiving Russian passports. Then other measures were taken. That's more recent, but it also reflects that kind of trend that hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, was declared that it wouldn't be accepted when it comes to energy trade or customs transaction. There was a switch announced to the Russian state curriculum in public schools and education completely in the Russian language across DNR, LNR starting September 1st, and actually started. I've been reading dispatches from Luhansk by an anonymous woman who writes for Ukrainska Pravda. And of course, you probably have to write anonymously, but she writes just her daily observations, and it's a fascinating source on what is life like there on the ground. Her name is Anna Vostochnaya. That's, of course, a pen name. But she wrote something very interesting and in many ways sad, but also indicative of what's going on there. She said the textbooks, Ukrainian textbooks and exercise books, for the first couple of years since the Russian and Russia-backed forces occupied those territories, those books were just kept on the shelves in the school offices. Then they were moved to storage units. And then this year, they started recycling them. And she kind of reports that sense of abandonment. I think they are recycling it. And they lost faith that they would ever be needed again. So now the Day of Russia was declared a national holiday in DNR. In both places, there were some interesting renamings. There were decrees passed that Donetsk should be referred to as Stalino in any kind of publication that deals with anything that again, relates to World War II, whether it was the attack of Germany on Russia, any kind of anniversary of any battle affecting the region, etc., etc. So you have the resurrection of Stalin and his henchmen through these titles. There are all kinds of programs of cultural integration. There is one going on now with Russia at Heart, engaging all kinds of groups and writers. Sports teams are competing in the Russian championship. I just read this report.
Sorry, if you could please wrap it up. We have a couple more presentations and not a whole lot of time.
Okay, all right. Unfortunately, I don't see the, yes. Now, finally, I will wrap it up with just showing you the dynamics of the conflict, armed conflict in the East. There hasn't been actually much change until the late July ceasefire. During that period, there was expectation that perhaps the conflict should stop early. Ukraine appealed for universal ceasefire through Kuchma. Donbas rejected it only after Putin and kind of engineered that deal with Zelensky. The fighting stopped, but I analyzed the daily reports during the first month or so of the pandemic, and predominantly the targets were on the Ukrainian side and the origination of the attacks on the Russia-controlled side. One thing we also see that weapons in violation of these agreements, the number has diminished since 2019. But there hasn't actually been much diminishing since early 2000 regrouping in the eastern areas. I would end, however, with just one thing. There are two quick points. One, that what does it mean for the peace process? It basically means that the ceasefire, and again, it was instituted that way, is promoting, solidifying, legitimizing the status of these occupied territories as some kind of de facto legitimate actors. Notably, the Joint Council for Coordination and Control is the entity that is very heavily promoted in DNR, LNR, and they emphasize the fact that it's the Ukrainian military and the what they call people's militia of these territories that patrols the peace. So that de facto legitimizes them. But on the other thing, I say, okay, so that means the hope for integrating those territories is diminishing, and they are likely to be indeed partitioned, just as Sergei said. But
we need to wrap up. Sorry.
Okay, then I'll end right here.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Thank you. Very interesting stuff. But we have a couple more really interesting presentations coming up. So next is Oksana Shevel, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University. And she will be speaking on Orthodox churches and religious politics in Ukraine, local and national dynamics.
Great. Thank you, Henry. Thank you. Good to see everybody virtually. So without further ado, let me go to my, let's see, is it showing?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So so let me begin by kind of specifying, obviously, the religious politics is a very broad topic. What specifically I'm focusing on in my presentation, and just to let you all know, so it is based on research that I've done in Ukraine last summer when I did interviews with various stakeholders involved in this battle over the establishment of Orthodox Church of Ukraine and reaffiliation of parishes. And also on some sort of open source investigations of debates and legislation and so forth. So basically, I'm looking specifically at events that unfolded in Ukraine since the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was established in December 1998, and this church received the Thomas of Autocephaly from Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in January of 2019. And since then, this so-called reaffiliation process began, whereby Orthodox parishes that used to belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, I'm going to say in a minute, for those who are not very well involved in the topic about this competing Orthodox Church history, they began to vote essentially to switch to the OCU. And these results were sort of widely reported. By early 2019, there were some 500 parishes who supposedly, quote unquote, reaffiliated or switched. But then if you actually look at this process of reaffiliation a little closer, this process is actually much more complicated, and it's not exactly clear what reaffiliation means. Essentially, all of these attempts to switch affiliation were contested by the Moscow Patriarchy. Most of them remain contested to this day. They're sort of bogged in disputes, legal battles that are ongoing across regions of Ukraine. So I try to understand sort of more, I guess, deeply what exactly this confrontation is all about, why the affiliation process has proved to be so difficult and actually remains legally incomplete. And my main findings, just to kind of preface what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes, is that because of what I call a multi-level ambiguity that exists at varieties of levels in Ukraine, be it legislation that defines key terms such as religious community, meeting of religious community, kind of the question who is legally entitled to make decisions on behalf of the parish to switch canonical affiliation, to administrative practices regulating this process, to actually attitudes of Ukrainian Orthodox believers and what it actually means to be Orthodox in Ukraine. That there is this ambiguity and kind of fluidity at all levels of these stages, which in turn I argue so far, that's kind of my conclusions to this point of my research, essentially limits the ability of all stakeholders to achieve their objectives. So this is not good news for either supporters of, say, the establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, because the process has not yielded quite the results that many had hoped. It's also not necessarily good news to supporters of the Moscow Patriarchy that disputes all of these reaffiliations and basically doesn't want reaffiliation process to continue. So I'm going to talk more about it, how this ambiguity essentially hinders the ability of all stakeholders, and nobody is able to harness it conclusively to their advantage to achieve their specific political objectives. And perhaps, to borrow Lucan's way terms, what we end up having is this religious pluralism by default. And that, I would argue, has not changed. And therefore, sort of this change from Poroshenko to Zelensky presidency, even though Poroshenko was obviously very activist, I'm going to talk more about it in a minute, supporting OCU, I would actually say that the change is not as dramatic. So in other words, Poroshenko was not quite able to achieve what he wanted. fully, and there are reasons for it. And I don't think we would see dramatic changes under Zelensky, who is much less personally, say, involved in religious politics and takes much more kind of hands-off attitude. So let me unpack some of these things. So again, just very, very briefly, because the background to religious Orthodox conflict in Ukraine goes back not just years, decades, even centuries, going back all the way to the 16th century, but I'm going to focus on the post-Soviet period. As many of you might know, in the post-Soviet period, there were essentially three competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine. One Ukrainian Orthodox Church in unity with Moscow Patriarchate, which was the largest as far as the number of parishes, although its support has been declining over the years. I'm going to come back to it. It was the only one that was canonically recognized by the World Orthodoxy, so that was the canonical church. And then there were two sort of breakaway or splinter churches. Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate was particularly important, but there was also smaller Ukrainian Autocephalous Church that were not canonically recognized, meaning they were considered sort of schismatic in the Orthodox canons. And there has been this long-standing campaign or drive, we can say, for establishment of autonomous autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church that would be fully independent and not under Moscow control or influence, administrative subordination, as the OSCE MP has been. So this process eventually culminates in this granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly when Kiev Patriarchate and Ukrainian Autocephalous Church formally dissolved themselves and then kind of reformed into the Ukrainian the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which received Tomos of Autocephaly. President Poroshenko has been very active, kind of involved in promoting this process, appealing to Bartholomew to grant Tomos. Parliament issued appeals, and so. But so sometimes, and I think not incorrectly, it is often sort of highlighted how the process has been politicized, right, and how kind of the establishment of the OSCE was this sort of political game or strategy of Poroshenko. He, of course, also tried to use it unsuccessfully in his election campaign. But I would emphasize that I think this politicization argument only takes us so far, because Ukrainian state leaders have never been fully neutral in this Orthodox dispute. In fact, maybe it was kind of impossible to be neutral, and I'll come back to it at the end. I think it raises an interesting question, at least to my mind, what exactly state neutrality in this religious would look like. So essentially, successive presidents have, as Ukrainian foreign policy course oscillated between kind of more pro-Russian and more pro-Western direction. We see the same thing when it comes to top leadership of the state supporting or opposing the idea of a autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, with Kuchma and Yushchenko with Kravchuk and Yushchenko in particular, and Poroshenko being sort of more in favor of it, Yanukovych being against it, and Kuchma changing his position. For the sake of time, I won't go into details, but that has also been sort of his multivectoral policy. Also is reflected in his attitude towards the question of Ukrainian church autonomy. Now, the popular attitudes and practices are very important. Again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight what I think are some of the key things to keep in mind, which create an overall context in which then this battle for parish reaffiliation has unfolded. Ukraine does have regional differences when it comes to religious practices and practice of Orthodoxy specifically, but they are actually more complex and more nuanced than sort of simply East-West divide of Ukraine. I'm going to show some visuals in a minute. The fluidity and hybridity of Orthodox faith and practice is also a very important reality. Sociologists and anthropologists have documented here, especially the work of Catherine Warner and Tonike Metravelli is important, and I learned a lot from their work on sort of what social practice of Orthodoxy is in Ukraine. People have what Catherine Warner calls ambient faith, like a blend of secularism, belief, doubt, non-belief, kind of not really, irregular church attendance, combination of practices that would not be considered canonical Orthodox, and yet people self-identify as Orthodox believers. Mertavelli points out what he calls identitarian in-betweenness, which to his mind, again, as a matter of social practice, makes it essentially impossible to determine what exactly membership in a religious community means. Also, we see this hybridity and fluidity in many of the polls that show two particular things. Again, I'm going to show a visual in a minute. First of all, declining support for the Moscow Patriarchate Church over the years. So the church remains institutionally strongest as far as the number of organizations, parishes, monasteries, and so forth that it has. But as far as popular support for this church, it has been on decline. So again, it kind of creates this ambiguity that, if you want to sort of say that this church is the strongest, you would point to the number of institutions that it has. If you want to say that actually it's less popular than it claims, you would point to opinion polls. So let me illustrate some of these things. So this map, and here I'm using very helpful maps put together by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute as part of the Digital Atlas of Ukraine project. So the shading shows religious organizations per thousands of inhabitants, 100,000 inhabitants. So you see, again, not surprisingly, that the West being kind of generally more religious than the East. Right, but then if you look at the confessional belonging, what I want to kind of highlight in this map, that actually Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy has its stronghold not so much in the east and the south, but in this kind of center, west, northwest. This is where they have, this is another illustration for it, the Moscow Patriarchy parishes per 100,000 inhabitants. Again, because of higher religiosity, of course, in the Galicia regions, the Greek Catholic Church predominates. So it's really the center, kind of the west, the north, west of the country. To add sort of more to the interesting nuances and ambiguities, when sociologists actually poll believers of Kiev Patriarchy and Moscow Patriarchy in these regions, they often don't find dramatic political preferences between these groups. So this region, kind of center-west, right, let's look a little bit at the polls here. So we can see, right, growing support for Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchy, declining support for Moscow Patriarchy, and then again highlighting this feature of sort of fluidity and hybridity and non-canonical maybe expressions of Orthodoxy. This large popular group, which dominates in all regions except for the Western macro region, who define themselves as simply Orthodox, right? So they essentially, people don't want to tie themselves, institutionally speaking, to any one of these competing churches, right? And here, finally, coming to the switches of the parishes, again, these are the parishes where the vote to switch was taken. These are not necessarily the cases where sort of formally, legally, the process was complete, but again, we see them concentrated in the center, west, and northern parts of Ukraine, where I said, kind of to surprise of some who are sort of used to see more this east-west division of Ukraine, this is where institutional stronghold of Moscow Patriarchy has been. I should also point out that vast majority of these parishes are rural communities with just one church. So the issue of switching affiliation was much less, we can say, dramatic or even necessary in larger urban centers where there is more than one church in a particular locality. So people could simply go to the church that they preferred, since all the former Kiev Patriarchy and autocephalous parishes became parts of the newly established OCU. But in rural communities with just one church, I mean, this is where most of these conflicts are, right? So why has this reaffiliation process has turned out to be so conflictual? Here I'm coming to this illustration of these various ambiguities that I argue had greatly impacted the outcomes. Key terms such as what religious community is, what constitutes a meeting of religious community, is very vaguely and broadly defined in state legislation. For example, there are cases, again, I'm not going to go into details, but the courts have offered contradicting interpretations. For example, if the term a parish meeting is identical or distinct from the term general meeting of religious community, both of these terms are used in the legislation, and it is general meeting of religious community that is allowed to make decisions to change reaffiliation. Traditionally, again, Orthodox parishes do not have fixed membership, unlike many other religious groups. So it's actually, there are no sort of member rosters. And again, this practice of Orthodoxy has been quite fluid, and historical Orthodox Church itself basically claimed all residents in a locality unless they explicitly belong to different religion as their quote-unquote flock. Right, Orthodox parish charters or statutes themselves define membership criteria very vaguely. They emphasize the regular attendance, for example, is one of the criteria, but it's not defined what regular attendance exactly constitutes. And last but not least, even way before Thomas, the Moscow Patriarchy Church engaged in this very kind of top-down campaign, and that actually originates in the developments of the Russian Orthodox Church already in Russia from the mid-1990s to centralize control of their parishes. That creates some conflict, arguably, with Ukrainian legislation, because Ukrainian legislation actually makes parish communities autonomous legal entities. So they're supposed to be, in charge of things such as property and so forth. But these newly centralized statutes try to take a lot of autonomy of parishes away and make the bishops much more in control of essentially any level of parish decisions. to what extent these new statutes that the campaign.
Apologies.
Yes, I'm at the last part. Just 1 minute, right? Again, sort of the attempts to re-register these centralized parishes was mixed. Now, so when it came to the switching, I'm literally like 1 minute. So the positions of the two churches became very different. Moscow Patriarchy essentially argued that only the priest was in a position to say who is and is not a member, and therefore only the priest is in a position to call a meeting. The OCU position, which was also supported by the Ukrainian state elites at the time, was that all members who consider themselves belonging to local religious community, especially in communities with just one church, could actually call a meeting and vote to switch. So we essentially had, oftentimes in these contested cases, two groups of people would gather together and make completely different decisions, whether to stay with the OCU or to switch to the Moscow Patriarchy. So to wrap it up, kind of what are the consequences of this? So because of this legal and rules and ambiguities, state actors were in a position to apply the law quite differently. So in other words, they could adopt interpretation favoring the Moscow Patriarchy position or Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But at the same time, right, really neither central state officials nor officials at the local level nor the activists supporting particular interpretation could be guaranteed that the interpretation would actually favor them. So in other words, this ambiguity kind of canceled out powers of competing interests. So there was no guarantee that one side would win in this debate. And again, I have many cases and to document this. So I would argue that this has not changed. That has been the case under Poroshenko. Despite, again, very activist position of the central state, it remains the case today. The end result kind of becomes this, religious pluralism by default. And the last thing I just throw on the table potentially for future discussion, I sort of wonder, as I did this research, if we say the state should be neutral, like what really this neutrality would look like in the circumstances when really the law could be interpreted different ways, and what would happen, and is it desirable, kind of normatively speaking, if the state somehow is neutral, and then the stronger party in this debate, better financed, better legally kind of prepared, would actually win these battles over affiliation, right? So I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have some interesting discussion about it. Thank you, Henry.
Okay, thank you. So our final speaker is Alexander Sushko. But just before turning to him, I just want to note that we'll have a little time for question and answer discussion afterwards. So if you have questions, urge you to send them either directly to me or to the chat. I have a few and I'll kind of group them, and I think we'll have time for one round of questioning. So let me turn things over to Alexander, who is Executive Director of the International Renaissance Foundation in Ukraine. And his topic is U.S. dual diplomacy and the decline of U.S. soft power in Ukraine. Floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. So first of all, this is a great pleasure to me to back to this our community of experts to discuss a variety of in relationships within the last couple of years. And a memo, but I'm sure that there will be a reason to do it in the next few months. So
Okay, Alexander, you're breaking up a little bit. I think maybe we'll try your turning video off to see if we can get you more clearly.
there will be better audio sound. So my idea is to bring some expertise into the case, which was extremely vital due to the top political developments last year, like impeachment in the United States, which was determined by the story of certain conspiracy when the Ukrainian portfolio was interpreted in a way as case of interference of private political considerations and interests into bilateral relationships of Ukraine and the United States. And in the story of impeachment is over. However, the whole agenda is continuing to be a case for bilateral relationship, and unfortunately, this is a case which makes troubles and continues to bring troubles into Ukraine-US bilateral relationships. First of all, this comes about the real loss of integrity and coherence of the US foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine in the last couple of years. First of all, this is clear that the US foreign policy as an integral concept was never so weak as it is now, just because there are two parallel lines. First one, the State Department and the US Embassy in Ukraine political agenda, which produce a kind of the legacy and continuity when it comes to the longer term story of US-Ukraine policy making. But on the other hand, there is another agenda which was generated after President Trump came to power due to his probable intentions to use Ukrainian portfolio as an instrument to gain additional arguments against his rivals in the Democratic Party. And this story is continuing. Unfortunately, we have witnessed a number of cases, and the Biden-Burisma case is just one of them. And all these cases were about to derail the entire bilateral agenda, including countering corruption, including support of the civil society, including US anti-corruption policy. And all these elements of US policy were targeted by the group of Rudy Giuliani and his team, who were very active starting from the spring 2019. And this story is not over. In Ukraine, we will probably have just in a few weeks, we hope to have a new ambassador, Kate Dayton. We hope to have them approved in the Senate. However, there is still uncertainty to what extent the US Embassy in Ukraine is able to provide a coherent and consistent political agenda, which will be perceived by Ukrainian political actors as a genuine and coherent US foreign policy. Because what we see this year is continuing attempts of various vested interests to present US foreign policy as a whole as a total failure due to the using these instruments of what we call dual diplomacy, with whole this spectrum of our arguments by Rudy Giuliani, who openly targeted the whole efforts of the US diplomacy in Ukraine started from early 2000s, portraying all this US diplomacy as that directed to satisfy only the interests of the Democratic Party, not the entire US. And then this story is not over. So my conclusion, as for this is a provisional conclusion, but the U.S. policy in Ukraine has never been so weak as it is now, and there is a unique duality and inconsistency determined by the vested interests in the American political elite and the use of the interests of the use of I just recently released the next portion of the data which he considered to be a compromise against American diplomacy in Ukraine and those who are perceived to be the friends of US in Ukrainian establishment. So finally, we have a big uncertainty and big concern. How can we restore the integrity and the strength in the US foreign policy, taking into account that many things, so it will depend on the US elections, but also it will depend on the behavior of Ukrainian political found the way to various branches, wings, and groups of the US establishment. And these groups openly demonstrated their willingness to use Ukrainian factor just as a battlefield and as an element of the US domestic political playground. So this is a big challenge. And the question is, to what extent in the future this duality of the US foreign policy will be continued, or there will be a reverse, and then the situation has to change after the presidential election in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. We have a number of questions. Pretty much all of them, interestingly, focus on topics related to public opinion one way or other. So what I'd like to do is let's go in the reverse order as we spoke. So I'll start first with Alexander, then go to Oksana, Mikhail, Serhiy, and then Elise. And I have one question, at least one question for each person. So let me just pose those, and then we have about 2 minutes for each person. So I ask you to try to keep your responses concise. So for Alexander, this is a question from Alicia Sorite. Apologies if I mispronounced that. And it was to everyone, but let me pose it to Alexander because it's right in his wheelhouse, which is how important is public U.S. support for Zelensky's conflict diplomacy to Ukrainian public opinion about Zelensky's ability to actually achieve peace? And then for Oksana, I have 3 questions that you can address as much as you can. One is that it's interesting to take a hands-off that Zelensky seems to take a hands-off attitude towards religion, and so kind of with the declining support in the polls that he's been experiencing, is there any possibility that he might have incentive to kind of shift on the religious position? And from Yulia Nikitina, kind of related to that, how religious are Ukrainians? How many people really church? Do people really care about religion, and to what extent do they care? And from Susan Stewart, also to Oksana, could you say something about the position of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine on the COVID-related developments? So do they have similar or different approaches? So for Mikhail, the question is are the DNR, LNR, Ordlo leaderships at all pressured by public opinion? You indicated that they're kind of totally ignoring it, but is there any incentive for them to listen to public opinion here with regard to staying in Ukraine, for example? And for Serhiy, it's interesting that you note, this is for me, it's interesting that you note Zelensky's, a possible realignment of Zelensky's position towards Poroshenko's position. Do you see this as in the larger pattern that one could see in Ukrainian politics over time, where there seems to be a typical drift to the West after a candidate gets elected, much like Kuchma did after his initial election? And then finally for Elise, what incentives does Zelensky's declining popularity put on him in the realm of foreign policy and Donbas? So let's go ahead and start with Alexander, and then we should have time for one round, and then we can wrap it up. So Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for the question. So my feeling is that certainly Volodymyr Zelensky is much willing to be encouraged by the US as well as the other big powers. However, we need to understand that after his story of last year, after his traumatic visit to the United States in September last year, he is very, very much careful when it comes to the Ukraine-US relationships as a whole, and in particular, searching for support. I think that the issues where Zelensky would be happy to get support is those where this support will be bipartisan, not determined by the US any kind of domestic agenda or any kind of the battle story. So I think that after the year and after impeachment story, I think that really for Zelensky, playing American card is something which he is very, very much careful.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's go to Oksana. So you have about 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to try to do 3 questions justice, but it probably won't be super detailed. But let me start with the last one about COVID. Actually, glad it was brought up because I didn't have time to talk about kind of how the churches are positioning themselves differently. And this is actually one of the differences. And many people who kind of study the future of the church kind of more from religious institutional perspective point out that OCU actually has a chance to establish itself as kind of more progressive, more modern, more in that kind of church. So they actually did take quite different positions on the COVID. They, for example, advocated, both mask wearing and abstaining from religious services, and that goes like together, which UCMP has done to much less degree, if at all. It also goes together to introducing some kind of novelties at least considering introducing certain novelties to the practices. For example, allowing believers to sit down in the church, which was not historically, an issue or the practice in the Orthodox churches there. So again, I think that kind of takes to this, is that kind of more democratic, quote unquote, future potentially for the OCU. On the question of Zelensky, like if he would, likely to change his more kind of neutral stance, I would say 2 things here. First of all, I think it doesn't really matter, honestly, because there are people in his entourage who do have, like if he say we admit that he maybe doesn't have strong preference, favoring one church or the other, there are certain people around him who do. And we have seen this, I didn't have time to go into the presentation, kind of the battles over, say, the appointment of the head of the government agency in charge of these religious affairs. There is his first deputy, I think, of his presidential administration is considered to be ardent supporter of the MP. So there is kind of this positioning behind the scenes. But what we see from the polls, and I think Poroshenko's lesson also shows this, there is relatively little to gain, actually, electorally, from kind of really clearly associating yourself as a politician with the kind of religiosity, maybe more generally, or backing up a particular church more specifically. Obviously, Poroshenko's army face language campaign did not work so well. And we also see this in the polls. People do not trust politicians more if they are religious, right? They don't want politicians to kind of clearly, become actors in the religious field. So I think, I don't expect to that Zelensky would change his, position, because there is really not much to be gained. And finally, on Yulia's question about popular attitudes, I mean, they really do run a gamut. I mean, one thing I would say that Ukrainian Orthodox, people who self-identify as Orthodox, are more religious than Orthodox believers in Russia. We have higher church going and things like that. But there is great variation here also across the regions. I was actually just trying to briefly look up some polls as Henry was asking the question. And if, say, some 70% of people self-identify as Orthodox, only 58% of these say they attend religious services. And of these, half attend only on big holidays. So it's really less than 20% who attend regularly, kind of like, weekly. But then there is also big regional divide here that, there is much more religiosity and church attendance in the West. And to your question, like, do people really care? Again, it really varies. Like, some people really don't care, but some people really did care. But a lot of these parish, battles over parish affiliation were in villages when a substantial part of the local population actually decided, even though they may not have cared a few years ago, that after Euromaidan, after deaths of Ukrainian soldiers in the East, after some of the priests from Moscow Patriarchy sort of, refusing to even perform last rites. I mean, this was an exception, but there was basically this kind of energized support, right, for belonging to a certain church, or their particular parish being within a certain church. But that, again, runs a gamut, and it's not the case for all believers across the country. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you. So next to Mikhail.
Hello. Yes. Well, to answer the question very briefly, not much, if at all. And 2 points here. One is power literally flows from the barrel of the gun in those territories, whether it's through amassing local forces and ultimately being backstopped by Russia. So usefulness to Russia is the principal source of power and authority for leadership in these entities, and they have tremendous opportunities for coercion. So there is they're not democracies or hybrid regimes like Ukraine. They're pretty much quasi-military authoritarian statelets. And you have also the society. It's a self-selected sample in many ways in terms of social constraints on them. Millions of people left those areas. Some went to Russia, some left to the rest of the Ukraine. So you have both from the state and society less of an incentive to kind of have that genuine public opinion feedback. If they do listen to public opinion, I would venture to say it would be they may be more careful watching public opinion in Russia than in DNR or in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Serhiy.
All right. For your question. So I want to first say that Zelensky was never a pro-Russian candidate in the same sense that Leonid Kuchma was in 1994. Certainly Poroshenko tried to paint him as a candidate during the election campaign, but Zelensky took a lot of favorable positions that are favorable to the West. And we saw during the impeachment hearings that many American diplomats were actually very much excited about Zelensky's anti-corruption agenda. What I meant to say, of course, was that Zelensky at least indicated that he was more open to a compromise position on Donbas in dealing with Putin. And so when he became president, the range of alternatives that he had available was much broader. And the question then becomes, why did it narrow down again to the same set of preferences that we saw under Poroshenko? The bargaining position basically reverted back to the Poroshenko's time. And I think one of the key explanations here is the costs associated with the change of the status quo. And the costs are significant in general. Any status quo, change in status quo requires significant costs, but they're even higher in the case of Zelensky because he faced pushback both from the civil society actors and from the parliament. And we saw in multiple instances whenever Zelensky and his officials like Yermak tried to even change or introduce minor changes to the position of Ukraine, for example, on Steinmeier formula, or on an attempt to create a special council where you would have direct negotiations with the leaders of the separatist republics, they immediately reversed themselves back and changed their views once they faced criticisms from their political competitors. So in a way, I think that position, the Poroshenko's position, was again imposed on Zelensky because of the lack of willingness to pay the costs associated with change of the status quo and very uncertain benefits that this change in the policy promises.
Great, thank you. And Elise.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so the question is, what incentives does declining popularity put on Zelensky in the realm of foreign policy? And it's hard to know how Zelensky evaluates his declining popularity, since there are multiple possible sources for his declining popularity, including his response to the pandemic. But I think probably his team is very aware. And it also depends on whether Zelensky's going to run for president again. Right? Because if he is going to run for president again, then let's keep in mind that its elections have consequences, and he's probably well aware of some of the reasons why Poroshenko was voted out of office. And if he does not try to solve the war, if he does not make some kind of progress, even despite what civil society or the political parties may say, the voters may have the final say. And so if we continue to see a kind of concern with ending the war and concern with the people, there's another poll that I didn't show, a very recent poll showing concern with the lives and the suffering of the people living in Ordlo, then he's got to face those consequences. So I would expect that he's somewhat aware of it, but these are not as Stephanie Kudelia points out, these are not as imminent or as imminent as the political pressures he's receiving from mobilized civil society and political parties.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our speakers for a really interesting discussion, and thank you to everybody who attended and joined the discussion one way or other, and thank you for joining us generally. So we will hope to see you at the next session, which should be next week. So look for the announcement. If you want to see other events from Ponars or at IRES, it's at our website at ponarseurasia.org. Or yes. So I think without further ado, we'll go ahead and end it, and look forward to seeing you again. So thank you.